All right, hello YouTube. Welcome back. We are doing a part 2 video as a continuation of our part 1. And we're actually live on Twitch at the moment. I just finished my set of 30 wings. I figured now would be a good time to drop the knowledge on the chat and also to have a little mini Q&A session at the end. But essentially, the last video, if you all remember, talked about artifacts, and we used this little thing here where we basically went through the artifacts, talked about how much they're worth in terms of average rune rolls, right? Remember, the whole goal of artifacts is to be able to take them and figure out what they're actually worth in terms of substats, right? Like you can look at 1 CD as, 7 CD as a rune roll, but like what is damage, right? Or how should I value reducing damage? And so all of those we went over in the previous video. It's a lot of it's situational analysis, which is done in financial modeling or other types of situational based modeling. And you just kind of think of it in terms of Sumner's War and how it works. The reason why we have a follow-up is because in that one there, we made the assumption that the additional damage per stat artifact substat was based off of base stats. And as we've learned through your guys' comments and research and lots of probably an hour's worth of trying to crit and not crit my own unit, that it is indeed based off of total stats. And I wanted to figure out how much it was worth. So we went through and did some math. So I'm going to first show you a demo of what this looks like in game on 2 units, and then we'll go through some math. So for the first unit, I want to talk about Juno. So Juno, you're going to notice right away, super high amount of equivalent rune rolls. And what we mean as a refresher on equivalent rune rolls, meaning if I were to get a full 200% of this damage as a percent of speed, this is how much it's worth if I were to roll out that same amount of attack on my runes. So if I had a violent rune or a despair rune, how many full attack rolls would I need to equal a max roll here? And that answer is really, really high. And let's check out why. So if we go back in game here, let's first examine, and I'm only going to go through the case where the Juno's on crit rate. I have the math on the next slide in terms of it being on crit damage. I'll let you check that out on your own, and I'll walk through it too. But take my word for it, I spent a couple hours, an hour plus, going through and poking the units for crits and non-crits. So here we have my Juno as a little target dummy here, right? And so we want to test it. And we're bringing in our Juno. So for reference, here's the stats of the Juno. Pretty poor. I just kind of slammed whatever I had on it. And the whole point of this is noting how much total HP, attack, defense, speed, whatever it is. We want to figure out how much damage we do now with our artifacts, and then how much damage we do afterwards. From there, we're going to find out what the difference in damage is, and then figure out, okay, if I have this much difference in damage, how much would I need to get from my runes in order to achieve that same level of increase? So here are the artifacts. And intentionally, I picked artifacts that gave me plus HP or plus defense so that they would not alter the amount of damage that I did. So here, you'll see in the slides, I did the math in terms of how much expected damage we're going to get. But these are the artifacts I'm using. So let's check it out. Let's check out how much damage this Juno does. We're going to get 100% crits. Okay, so that's what we expect. So we're going to slow it down to times 1. And if you notice, my auto attacks do about 1,500 each, right? 1,500 each per autos. And this, my own Juno is hitting me back 1,600, 1,500, 1,500 plus, right? That's pretty heavy. If you remember back to the Junos in the past, they do a lot less. So this is a 1,500 per shot Juno. So we got that out of the way. Remember, upper 1,500s to 1,600s. Now let's take this out of the way. So I've spent probably 500,000 mana just like redoing these artifacts, taking them on and off to test the different numbers. But I'm just going to show you the results of what happened. So we're going to test it again, no artifacts. Remember earlier was 1,500 to 1,600-ish, somewhere around there. And in this situation, we now have no artifacts. So now our damage goes all the way down to about 960, 950-ish, 960 per upper 900s per crit. So I basically, without artifacts, went from upper 900s to with artifacts being at about 1,600. That's a huge difference in damage, right? So we want to figure out, all right, this is a very big difference in damage. What is that worth? Like, how many more runes would I need to achieve that? So let me bore you with some math here. So looking at this here, we want to start with the damage with artifacts and or without artifacts, right? And we saw that just now. It's about 940 when I recorded it. In the game, it was about 960. We're just trying to be directionally close. We don't need to be identical or on the spot because a lot of these are assumptions anyways, right? And my Juno differs from yours. Half of the people in the comments will probably have better Junos than that one because that one was crap. But without artifacts, you're looking at about 940. You're looking at about 940 damage a hit. With artifacts, 1600-ish. That represents a 71% increase in damage. And you can take my word for it. You can do the math on your own. Keep in mind though, the artifacts I showed you up front, the sum of those damage I'm expecting is 658. 658 is more than what I would expect to receive from if I had a max roll of damage as a percentage of speed, right? So we need to normalize that because maybe I brought juiced out artifacts, right? That's not fair as a comparison. So we want to normalize that, and you just basically take those as a ratio and multiply it by 71%. So the takeaway is if I was using one singular 200% roll damage as a percent of speed, I would get a 51.4% increase in damage per shot. Now, if I were to take this 51.4%, this would be equivalent to 16.2 rolls into attack, straight up. Keep in mind, a rune, when maxed out, has 8 rolls, right? You have your 4 base ones and then 1 roll per each power-up, right, if it's legend. So this is 2 full rolls that this Juno got from 1 max substat on the artifact, which is disgusting. And I think that shows you that this meta is really I think this is going to be a meta changer in terms of having all of these multi-hitters come into the meta. Like Juno used to just sit there and do nothing, and just being able to, for each stat, right, I can have my attack, my HP, my defense stats. The others won't be 16, but even if they're like 10 rune equivalents, or actually they can't because they couldn't roll as high. But even if they were 3 or 4s, like that's literally another set of runes on this Juno. Obviously, I have my predicted efficacy of 0.9, and that's just because I'm not going to be spamming skill 1 all the time. So I also took a mini shortcut because this damage increase does also add damage to your skill 2. And so you can add that in, and I would need to factor that in and take it as 1 hit. But I was a little lazy on the math. We're here to be directionally correct. So you multiply across, you're looking at about 14.6 rune rolls per that max substat, which is pretty giant. And I think that makes sense because it's a Juno, right? There was another unit I looked at, which was also Juno. Now, what I did here for this Juno was I also took this Juno and actually put it onto crit damage. And what I wanted to show with crit damage was what's the difference between if it doesn't crit and if it does crit? Because keep in mind, this additional damage as a percent of total stat is calculated after all of your defense, break, crit damage, all of those are factored in, then you add the additional damage left. And because of that, if you think about what that means intuitively, this is done after all your calculations and all your multipliers. It's a flat rate. So if you think of it as like if the bigger shots, basically the bigger pieces of damage, like say that's 90 and your smaller pieces are 40. If you're adding a straight 10 to each, it's a smaller percent increase for anything that does a much bigger sum of damage, right? So let's walk through the math. So when I had it on crit damage and I had it without my artifacts, I was doing about 590 a shot, okay? And I use the same artifacts for this. Now, when it did crit, it was doing 1475 a shot without my artifacts, when it was on crit damage build, all right? Now, when I added my artifacts, my damage jumped. When it didn't crit, I hit 1265, and when it did crit, I hit 2130. So if you do the math and you look at this across the board here, what actually happens is, as a percent of damage increase, it's much greater when you don't crit versus when you do crit. Like you're still, because you're adding that flat damage, right? And this is empirical. I just kind of recorded the numbers. So if you add it, it won't be quite 658, but it's close. It's close enough. So you'll notice the damage percent is much bigger on not critting versus critting. Again, you still need to normalize it down as if you had just that max roll, right? My artifacts tended to be a little bit better. The summation of all those stats were better than one max roll. So I normalize it down, and what you get is you have a percent damage increase that is 82% for the non-crits, and for the crits it's 32%. And so each of these represents a rune equivalent number of rolls of 26.9 and 14.4. And actually, you know what? I'm going to show you one thing too. Like, I think there was a little confusion here for this one, but ignore the heavy Excel thing. But when we talk about total damage, and I want to scale that total damage down to how many rolls we have, here's what I'm doing all the time. So what I'm doing here is when I walk through the math, and this is for the Perna math, but bear with me. First thing I want to do is figure out, okay, with my increase in damage, like let's say it's 50%. In this case, my increase in damage was 4% for my Perna, okay? How much did it actually increase my attack in a gross amount? So how much attack was that? So if this is for my Perna, we'll see in a later slide. How much did I increase my attack? 124 attack, right? So how much percent is that worth? Now you have to take this 124 and divide it by your base. So this is actually worth 14.2% attack for that Perna, right? And if it's 14.2, I just have to divide it by 8%, and that's 1.77 rolls. So that's how you do that calculation where if I have a percent damage increase of a certain amount, that's equivalent to how many rune rolls, right? If you tie it back to the attack. So that's how you mathematically break that down. So when I talk about the overall rune equivalence number of rolls, though, what we're looking at here now is you have crits and non-crits. So when it does not crit, it's worth 26.9 to your unit. But when it does crit, it's worth less. It's worth 14.4. So they're worth different amounts. So what you do is what we call in math a weighted average, right? So I assume my Juno actually had less crit rate because it's terrible. But a typical Juno on crit damage will have about 70% crit rate. So you take your 70% and you multiply it by the rate of crit, which is 14.4, right? The rune equivalent number of rolls. Take your 30%, multiply it by 26.9, and you have 18.15. And then your predicted efficacy, similar to the other one previously, is 90%. Multiply across. It's actually worth, and I think this stat will vary based off of the exact Juno stats and the crit rates and things like that. If I had a lower crit rate, maybe it's a higher adjusted rune equivalent. You have a 16. Now, I'm personally going to build my Juno on crit rate and have it be tanky. But these are both worth a very high amount for similar builds, right? But this just goes to show for Juno, it's worth a ton. Again, key takeaways. If you have high CD, you actually get less benefit, right? Because each shot is doing more damage. So as a percentage, your additional flat damage is not worth as much. So your overall percent damage increase is not as high. But again, this is absolutely nuts for Juno. I don't know if you guys are interested. Maybe if there's enough comments that indicate so, we can walk through if your Sierra should be on bomb damage or additional damage. But we'll talk about that on a different day. So we have for multi-hitters, it's absolutely nuts for Juno. But what does it look like for non-multi-hitters? So I did this math, and before I get into this math, I will show you in game what it looks like. So let's go back in game. Let's pull up the Perna, and I'm not going to walk you through everything because I literally spent 45 minutes plus trying to get my Perna not to crit. And that was one of the most frustrating things. I also wish I didn't pick a Perna because if you read skill 2, the more HP the enemy has, the more damage you do. Meaning for every test I do, I have to make a shot and then pull back out, which is a giant pain in the butt. So here are the artifacts here's my Perna stats, all right? Just for your reference, you can backtrack it with the math that I'm going to do. It's got a good amount of attack. It's meant to hit hard. It's meant to hurt. Now, artifact-wise, I have 88% of speed, right? 88 damage is 88% of speed. And then on my HP side, I have actually quite a few stats. So we've summed it all up, and I believe that this one here, the expected damage is about 600 increase in damage. So let's go test it out, right? And keep in mind the main stat is defense, so it doesn't add damage to me. So let's go do some damage. Let's go smack the Juno a bit. So let's bring in the Perna. And let's check out damage. So we're going to start with skill 1s. I want to look at skill 1s and skill 2s separately, and we'll go through why later. But you have to look at them separately because you use these skills in different ways, and skill 2s hit harder. So you have to factor that in. So if I hit here, that's 6,200, right? 6,200 a shot. It's another 6,200 a shot. All right, let's keep going. That's 6,200. That's 6,300. My Perna can't miss a crit, apparently, which is funny because in RTA, I never crit. I miss these a lot more. But when I'm actually trying to test and get on with my life, I can't. I can't avoid my crits. So that's 6,100, right? And let's try it again, right? 6,100. Let's see if we can go until we don't get a crit. Someone's asking in chat if Feng Yan becomes SS tier, and it becomes a lot better. I don't know if it's SS tier yet, though. There's a lot of things that determine tier lists. So this Perna can't seem to miss a crit. So we may just have to take my word for it on the number for when it doesn't crit. So we may just have to take that number. So 6,300, I give up. We're going to be here all day, and this will be a 2-hour long video just watching a Perna auto attack if we wanted to make this work out. So we're going to look at skill 2 now. So skill 2 does about somewhere around 12,500 a shot, right? We'll do it one more time. Remember, the higher HP they are, the more damage you do. So 12.5k. Let's try this again. And we're going to do another shot here. And this is about 12.8k. So pretty hefty Perna. So remember, about 6,000 something and then upper 12s, right? So let's go to this Perna. Let's burn another 100,000 mana. By the way, artifacts cost so much to power up. That hurts. So let's test this out and do this again. So we're going to start with skill 2 and then get into skill 1. So skill 2 here now does, if you look at this, 11.7. We did 12.5 to 12.8 earlier, and now does 11.7. It's actually pretty significant. Skill 1s, they do 5.7, right? We were doing 6.2-ish, 6.1. We're now at 5.7. So that's actually a good amount. It's quite different. 5.7, right? 5.7, 5.6. So you can actually see quite a bit of damage there. Let's test it one more time just to be sure, right? That these aren't just made up numbers. So skill 2 here, 11.9. Again, earlier we had 12.7, 12.8, 12.9. So I think that's good for the numbers. Let's go back to the math, the fun stuff. So here are the numbers I recorded earlier when I actually was successfully able to get a non-crit. So take my word for it. So when I had artifacts, I was doing 2.9 and then skill 1, 2.9 without the crit, 6.3 with the crit, as we saw. Skill 2 with artifacts, 12.5. Actually we saw higher numbers, right? So artifacts would generally look better, but I don't know. I ran this quite a few times and that's what it came out to be. So maybe we just got lucky and had bigger numbers there. And then without crits, somehow I was magically able to get 1 through, and it did 59.30. And then without artifacts, you can check out the numbers there. So what this represents in an increase of damage, right? If you take 2910 minus 2300, and then that's 610 divided by 2300, you get 23.5% increase in damage. Do that math down the columns. And if you do that math, I remember, similar to earlier, I have to normalize it, right? We have pretty hefty artifacts, I guess. So a max speed roll on this Perna is equivalent to 487 damage. So I need to then tune it down as if I had that max speed roll, right? Instead of all these stats here that make it OP. So this damage percent is now this much. And if I were to tie it to the rune equivalent number of rolls, remember, this is where the Perna math came in. And let me show you again, just as a reminder. The Perna math kind of looked like that, right? Where I was taking my total amount increase. Like if I were to take the amount for skill 1 without a crit, I mean, that's worth 8.3 rolls because I had an increase. I would need an increase in attack of 580 to achieve that. And that's the same thing as 66%, which is the same thing as 8.3 rolls of attack into your normal runes. So that's how that calculation, again, as a reminder, works. So going back to this, the chart here. So you have your rune equivalent number of rolls across the bat. Now, how do we get to the predicted efficacy? Because that seems pretty hard. Like, how often do we use this, right? So I'm going to assume an Obabo Perna, a faint memory Perna crit rate of 75% on on these units, on bruises. Typically, you'll want 85, 80, but I'm going to assume we're playing like the top tier G3s. So they have a crit rate of 75. So if you take your 75% crit rate, and actually I'll walk you through, I'll actually use Excel for this. And you actually, in terms of efficacy, the chance when you don't crit is 25%, right? Because you have a crit rate of 75%, right? Look at the formula bar up the top. So when you do crit, it is 75% chance of crit. When you don't crit, it's 25%. When you do crit, it's 75% of the time to crit. And then you alternate skill 1 and 2. That's why I multiplied by 0.5. The sum of these should add up to 1. And you can check here. The sum does add up to 1 because it is active at all times. It's just worth different amounts to you at all times. So that's how we got the efficacy, is that you crit at different rates. So we factor that in, and we factor that you're alternating shots between them. So going back to the slide here, if you take a sum product, and sum product means basically I take my 8.35 multiplied by, my efficacy, how often it's used, and just take these two, multiply it, take these two, multiply it, these two, multiply it, and add everything up. I get my total, on average, adjusted Rune equivalent number of rolls of 4. Meaning, if I had a max 200% damage as a percent of speed roll on my artifact, that's worth 4 full rolls on a Perna. One thing a couple caveats I want to keep in mind with this. Let's go look at the chart here, right? If we look at the chart here, crit damage was valued at a 3.21. Does that mean that additional damage is better than crit damage? The answer is really it depends, and the reason why is that if you look at the crit damage stat here, the crit damage had a kind of a lower efficacy because I was saying, hey, S2 represents more damage and so on and so forth, right? And this substat is not active for both skills. However, if I were to only care about burst, or if I were to only care about burst, I get my 4.28 the moment I make that shot, right? So if I value burst, this becomes increasingly important for me. The other thing you want to think about is when you look at these additional damage stats here, these are stats that assume that my opponent does not have a defense break, that I do not have attack buff, that I'm just straight, as we can see in the game here, we can assume that I'm straight just attacking this Juno, right? The moment I have an attack buff or a defense break, if you look back to what happened in the value of the equivalent rune rolls, you'll see that the actual damage, as my damage went up, the predicted efficacy, the rune equivalent rolls went down, right? The higher my hit was, the lower this is worth to me. So if I'm able to sink in defense breaks and things like that, this is worth a lot less to me. So takeaway from this is it really depends on situation scenario, but this is supposed to be the worst case you can get for additional damage stats. It's on these big high dealing damage units, and it's still worth a lot. So I think that these are going to be big game-changing stats for the meta. Look to see things. I'm going to be trying to build like Shihos, Ethnas, maybe Irises. I first pick Hathor a lot, so Iris may not work as much, but Prahas may be good. Your Oracles are crazy. Sierra, it is up in the air. I already know what I'm going to build mine on. It's going to be on additional damage, but you can do the math to see if you prefer the bombs or the additional damage, or you can ask me to do the math in the comments if you want. But that's kind of how it looks. It's pretty nutty how good this stat is. So that's kind of what I'm chasing for a lot of these. Obviously, for units that don't have additional multi-hits and you prefer the recovery or things like that, or you prefer straight heavier damage and you can get that defense break in, then you're going to want to be able to, you value the crit damage a bit more, right? But it comes down to math, and this lets you also understand the values of the rolls. If I have half of the speed roll but a full CD roll, go with the CD, and vice versa. If I got a half CD roll and a full damage roll, put that even on a Perna, right? That's something you want to think about. So this is the cheat sheet again for your example. I filled it back in. I've moved the other outdated stuff to the appendix, might delete it, but that's what it looks like. Hopefully that helps. Let's see if chat has a question. Chat does not have a question. I guess Twitch chat is stumped. I would recommend you watch this video and the previous video if you are genuinely interested in learning about Artifact Substats and the math behind it. It's basically trying to understand situational analysis, right? And the logic behind it, and think about that a lot. You may need to watch it a couple times because there's a lot of logic, a lot of nuances that go into it. Quite detailed, more so for the, I wouldn't say higher level players. Even a beginner could still use this to their advantage, know what to keep, what not to keep. But there's a lot of math behind it, a lot of theory. And there's a lot of simpler cheat sheets out there, but this is the way we look at it in terms of what it looks like for an RTA player trying to go from the gold stars to the red stars and up. So can I zoom in a bit, please? These slides are going to be in the YouTube link and are also !artifacts in my Twitch chat. So, and Julie and Lucian cleaves are a little different. We could go through these, but you also understand that additional damage and CD3, that's going to be dependent on what the multipliers look like. I haven't done that math to prepare, so that's something, if there's a demand for it, we could potentially walk through that. But anyways, hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. Hopefully that helps. Additional damage substats are absolutely ridiculous. I mean, I can show you my Tianlang. Like, by the way, Tianlang was a very good unit. Now imagine with these types of stats on it, does a ton of damage. We were doing a lot earlier in RTA, smashing those ragdoll comps and those Artifact comps. Super fun for me, not for them. So yeah, this stat is absolutely nuts, especially for units that do low amounts of damage. So I would highly recommend it. So yeah, thanks for watching, and let me know in the comments if you have any other questions or what else you would like to see.